It's going to be a second session focused on North Korean nuclear issues. And it's probably the continuation of the special lecture session done by Professor Chung-in. And we'll continue this session. And we have, including Professor Chung-in, we have 6 prominent scholars. But as Dr. Moon has made his own speech already, it's going to be exempted, and we're going to have 5 prominent scholars and experts working on this very important issue. I will give each of you about 12 and 13 minutes for the opening remarks, and then we will have a short break. Then we will continue our Q&A session. But before moving into opening remarks, I want to make also a couple of comments. And I will not go into introduction of each of you to save time, and also because all of them are already too known to most of us. And their workings and their activities are very transparent. So they are well known to us. I will skip that, but I will keep I'll quote their names when their turns are ready. I think we are turning into a very difficult and very complicated situations, especially as we are about to solve this problem through diplomacy and through transaction. We used to live in a very simple period, when we rely on only one method, only either dialogue or either only sanctions or pressure only. Then the solutions are very simple. We just stick to our prescriptions and wait until right moment. But now we know that the DPRK is already almost completed their nuclear armaments, and we don't have much time. And also we are using both dialogue tactics and also pressure tactics. And also we need to come up with some solutions. The problem is that when we are about to have these complicated approaches, the situation is very difficult. I would say this is somewhat a dilemma situation. Let me quote just a couple of dilemma situations that we are facing with. First, while we are somewhat okay with the dialogue with the DPRK, but the problem is the DPRK is accumulating fissile material even at this moment. And secondly, DPRK has a missile test. Is it violation of any agreements or not? This is certainly, if it's a short range, even if it's a short range missile, if it's a ballistic missile, this is a violation of UN Security Council. But on the other hand, as we are having this diplomatic approach, there is some big deal or small deal between Trump and Kim Jong-un that they are stopping nuclear tests and long-range missile tests. Then how do we see it, these short-range missiles? There is a somewhat gray zone. And also, we know that we have to, previously we just, this containment or pressure is okay. Now we are thinking of providing some security assurance to the DPRK. Then how do we do it? DPRK is even asking for, or just we are thinking that we need to provide regime assurance. We know how to provide the security assurance, not to invade, but we don't know how to provide regime assurance. That's another difficult question. So there are full of these occasions. Also, we are quite good at asking DPRK to do something. You violated this and that, so you need to fix that. Now we are asking them to get rid of all these fissile material production capabilities, so-called Yongbyon Plus. But we don't know what will be our compensation for that. And as we are about to have a transaction, we need to know what we need to ask for. Also, we need to know what we are ready to exchange. But we are very good at asking, you do something, but we are not ready, prepared. We have a very thin consensus among us what we are going to provide to the DPRK. And also, verification, that's going to be technical, will be followed in the following sessions. But we know that previously, DPRK always work away at the time of verification and intrusive verification. So this time, are we going to insist on very tight MPT-like verification, or we are going to just live with a very loose verification, just like arms control, disarmament verification? That's very loose. On that, we don't have our own consensus. Always, whenever we are asking something to the DPRK, we have to have a maximum approach. But when we are about to come up with some, realistic things, we don't have our own, consensus among us. So all these questions are causing a lot of dilemmas among us. But that is probably that's what we have to deal with in this session. And as I said, we gathered together prominent scholars, and in this session, we will check again where we are, and probably more time will be spent on where to go and how to get there. A year ago too, when this Fire and Fury was turned into dialogue procedure, we have a very high expectation and hope. And then that dwindles, and at the moment, we are just see what Trump is doing. So it's a very murky situation and unstable situations. I think we need a lot of policy advices to all of you, and from the panelists and from the audiences. So let us begin our session. As I said, we have about 12 minutes, but you can have 1 or 2 more minutes if you like. That's okay. So let me begin with Dr. John Ba, the director of Korea Working Group at Harvard University. He's been following these nuclear issues for a long time, and he's been consulting with us, and we are very glad to have you back here.
Well, thank you all for having me here today, and thank you very much to the organizers for the opportunity to present again this summer. I wanted to present to you the cumulative key findings from a lot of the work that my research groups over the years have done. And this really goes back to my time in Washington, D.C., working for a U.S. government think tank. And many in the room I have learned a lot from through these Track 1.5 partnerships. And so with this, on the eve of potentially the resumption of U.S.-North Korean nuclear talks, there's a lot of discussion about potentially the focus on security guarantees, security assurances. And my target audience here really are the NARAC fellows. So this is really a briefing for you. With this, I wanted to focus on 3 things for my game plan. The first part is to look at the historical context of security guarantees and what I frame as the shocks to North Korea's security. The second is to examine the current dominant model, which is something that you wouldn't really think about, but I call it Beijing's sunshine policy with Chinese characteristics. We've heard before that Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un have met 5 times in the past 15 months. Well, that actually is the short report of their meetings. This goes on for quite a while if you look at the party-to-party contacts there. So I'll go into more detail about that particular model. And then the third part and the final part, I'll look at the implications, again, for U.S.-North Korea talks. The bottom line there, the key takeaway is that the U.S. has competition. When it comes to offering security guarantees to North Korea, it's not just a function of a U.S.-North Korea dynamic. So to begin with, the part of the sources of security assurances, these things aren't new, and we've heard it in different formulations. But in terms of a North Korean perspective, as they talk about security assurances in the context of Track 1.5 gatherings, their bedrock is the 1961, the 2 very comprehensive agreements that they had with the Soviet Union and with China. And those, in its essence, were positive security assurances. The Soviet Union and China were essentially guaranteeing the survival of the North Korean regime. In 1994, with the US-North Korea Agreed Framework, we look at this negative assurance, security assurance from the United States to North Korea, the promise and pledge from the US side not to attack North Korea. And then with the US-North Korea joint statement in 2000, this is towards the end of the Clinton administration, the reassurance with a statement back then about no hostile intent. And then most recently with the six-party talks in 2005, there was another issuance of a negative security assurance within the bedrock foundation of this multilateral approach to North Korea. Against this background, I wanted to take you down memory lane and look at the historical context in a little more detail. When it comes to these impact areas on North Korea's security, the first part of it is South Korea's Nordpolitik. It's a very remarkable diplomatic strategy towards the tail end of the Cold War. No one knew that the Cold War would end, but it was a remarkable diplomatic feat that South Korea, at that particular point in time, was able to reach out and have very comprehensive agreements with the Soviet Union and with China to fundamentally reorient their relationship with North Korea. The second is the demise of the agreed framework, and here we see the end of the reassurance phase. The third is the advent of the Bush administration. Steve Miller alluded to that in his opening remarks. The North Korean impact area, as they felt it, was the exacerbated sense of insecurity, the direct formulation by the United States linking the threat of terrorism to WMD and North Korea being a big actor within that. Then finally, with Kim Jong-il's 2008 health crisis, looking at some of the events that happened. One of the caveats that I would like to present is that in North Korea research, there's this ongoing dilemma between coincidence correlation and trying to find that evidence for correlation. It's elusive in some of these topics. I would argue that there's a lot of great research topics embedded in these. Happy to discuss that with NARIC fellows after the case here. To give you a brief overview of each of these critical shock time periods, the overview of the Nordpolitik period is quite striking because back then, South Korea, as this newly arrived Asian tiger on the international stage, had tremendous soft power. And its ability to use its economic incentives vis-a-vis Moscow and Beijing was enormously effective. If you think of Beijing at that time, '89, the Tiananmen incident happens. You see a situation where China is the focus of sanctions and trade embargoes. The ability of South Korea to help China not only rehabilitate its international image, but help China get the 1992 Asian Games is a critical factor of this Nordpolitik period. With respect to Moscow, the ability for South Korea to reach out and interact with Gorbachev as he's trying to see financing for some of the desperately needed economic restructuring in the Soviet Union enables South Korea to pull off this diplomatic feat. In terms of the significance, I draw your attention to China's normalization with South Korea in 1992. From a North Korean perspective, that was viewed as the great betrayal, and we see an almost lost decade of high-level party-to-party relations. It's during this lost decade, from the early 1990s to the early 2000s, that coincidence correlation, we see North Korea cranking out more plutonium from Yongbyon. We see North Korea essentially, from the estimates of economists, become a failed state after the Great Famine and the devastation that came in the second half of the 1990s. The impact on North Korea's security was profound. From the Soviet-North Korea relationship, the North Koreans were notified that Moscow would allow the mutual security component of their comprehensive bilateral relationship to become non-operative. In the case of the 1961 Sino-DPRK Security Pact, the security component was left ambiguous. It's still intact, but there have been some references that the Chinese only view that as coming to North Korea's defense if it were attacked. But here, the credible security assurance, while the 1961 Soviet DPRK Defense Pact operated, during that time period, a nuclear weapon state, the Soviet Union, offered a credible security assurance to a non-nuclear weapon state, North Korea. It's against this background that when you look at the demise of the agreed framework, you're looking at a remarkable, gradual, step-by-step formulation. In many respects, what we're hearing about today in terms of what could potentially be on offer between the United States and North Korea is a variation on that theme. It's not going to be the exact cookie cutter, but this is a very formative experience of having gone pretty far with North Korea. The significance in this time period, as we hear about the light water reactor deal, other things that the members of this audience are particularly well aware of, it's this October 2000 statement. Then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was able to author and develop in more detail about no hostile intent, and also talking about a new free relationship free from past enmity. This idea, as we hear today too, a new type of relationship between the United States and North Korea. A lot of the unique language from that time period as well is coming back into current vogue. Now, the impact on North Korea's security, it's an interesting feature from those who were involved at this time period. North Korea was adamant about getting the non-aggression treaty with the United States. And it's around the 2003 period, with a lot of encouragement and some would say pressure from the Chinese side, the US was encouraged to explore this in more detail. It went so far as in August of 2003, China brokering a trilateral meeting with the United States and North Korea and China, but China was really the host to explore this in more detail. Then all of a sudden in 2004, North Korea stopped insisting on this non-aggression treaty. And it's around this time period, though, that we see the rise and the further expansion of South Korea's Sunshine Policy. So the question is, what is the relationship as South Korea and North Korea are enjoying this type of close bilateral interaction, and it's dropping on the insistence of the non-aggression treaty? Quickly to the Bush Doctrine, the third component here, this is where the language is very explicit. The preemptive action as it relates to the Bush Doctrine. The quote here, and you see essentially the thinking and the resolve of John Bolton, to disarm dictators with WMD who can deliver those weapons or missiles or secretly provide them to terrorist allies. The concern was that North Korea would be the source of that material. And the big focus of adding North Korea to the axis of evil, for those on the US side, her interlocutors who went to Pyongyang or met with North Korean officials during this time period, the sense in Pyongyang that they were somehow next on the list when it came to the Bush Doctrine, very, very strong. And it's during this period that we essentially see the decision and then the action of the first nuclear test in October 2006 to see an acceleration of the North Korean nuclear weapons program. The fourth point I wanted to highlight in terms of background is what happens with Kim Jong-il's health crisis in 2008 period. There was a tremendous amount of open discussion about contingency planning. North Korea is collapsing. The United States and China has to essentially coordinate to pick up on the pieces of a failed state. And not only that, but a country that has nuclear weapons or nuclear capabilities. And it's during this open talk about essentially harvesting the organs of a freshly demised North Korea that we see another acceleration in North Korean nuclear activities. The North Korean response here is the missile tests, and then with the second nuclear test in May 2009. The impact on North Korea's security is pretty deep, pretty strong. The international reaction is along the lines of what we see as the beginning of the very intense application of sanctions on North Korea. The key takeaway from this time period, though, is this is when China starts to cooperate more closely on the implementation of UN Security Council resolutions. I think there is a linkage between that time period of the Great Betrayal in 1992, the North Korea-China normalization, my apologies, the South Korea-China normalization in the 1992 period, and China more closely coordinating on the implementation of these UN Security Council resolution sanctions. So quickly, just to do a bit of a comparison, then the comprehensive security assurance embedded package was really the Soviet DPRK treaty. You got the positive security assurance, you had very favorable economic assistance, military supplies and equipment well documented in terms of those transfers, regime recognition, the Soviets essentially being the biggest supporters of North Korea on the international stage, and civilian nuclear cooperation. When we talk about the references of two light water reactors, it's really in the 1980s where the Soviets are coordinating with North Korea on this. It's the revival of those two light water reactors during the agreed framework period where we see this resurgence of those past cooperative areas. Now, though, the model is the Beijing Sunshine Policy. What is that? In many respects, it boils down to the Communist Party of China accelerating its institution building with the Workers' Party of Korea. In a fairly short period of time, unrequited Chinese efforts to rebuild that relationship after that 92 period, the gaining of traction in the early 2000s, you're seeing the tremendous acceleration of those efforts now. So this isn't a recent, again, Xi Jinping meeting with Kim Jong-un 5 times in 15 months. That's an episode within this longer story. And the CPC bolstering the DPK regime stability, this is a remarkable survival guarantee of the regime as defined as the party. Now, with this, the nuts and bolts of it, the characteristics of Beijing Sunshine Policy with Chinese characteristics. Let me conclude with a couple of slides here. The part that I think is most striking is there's no linkage between the party-to-party interaction with denuclearization. That is saved for the now dormant 6-party talks. and other Chinese efforts to get other countries to talk about the denuclearization component, there hasn't been a single linkage between these deepening party-to-party ties with North Korean progress on denuclearization. The other element of this is the fact that it's the Communist Party of China. So it's not going to be the voting in of a new government and a new type of policy. This is going to be pretty consistent. During the period where Beijing's Sunshine Policy was the most bright in the late 2000s, in South Korea, there was a big debate about who lost North Korea. This was a time period where North Korea and China were concluding a lot of these 50-year concessionary leases on North Korean mineral resources. In the United States, a big focus on was the rebalance to the Asia-Pacific. North Korea was viewed more through the lens of a third-party issue rather than the direct focus of trying to resolve this issue. Then finally, for the North Korea piece here, Beijing's Sunshine Policy is a package deal. And with any package deal, there's strings attached. So the open-ended question is, what are those strings? And what is Kim Jong-un dealing with in dealing with the overall package himself? Then looking at the China factor in more detail, I draw your attention to the space between China and the United States. As I mentioned earlier, the party-to-party interaction has zero linkage to denuclearization. In the case of the United States, it's the polar opposite. And it's that distance between the two that gives a lot of space for North Korea to continue predominantly with its commercial activities. And so to draw your attention, this is a statistic that is documented using open source. The red line is inter-Korean trade. The blue line is China-North Korea trade. In the late 2000s, the China-North Korea trade increases dramatically. And the caveat here, though, is that this is based on what is essentially viewed to be underreported Chinese customs statistics. So this spike, this steepness is actually more dramatic than represented here. Now, the part that is really the area where you can track some developments out in the open, the significance of the China-North Korea accords is that China has been looking at North Korea as this instability variable, the big focus of their efforts in dealing with North Korea and the overall situation. And if you were to summarize it, it's that stability is greater than denuclearization, not a binary, yes or no on denuclearization. It is important to the Communist Party of China, as it's been stated by senior officials, but it's the stability of the regime and the definition of stability, particularly of the party. And so this is where you look at the consequences for the United States. And let me wrap up with this column here. This is a part where China, in following the investment trends inside of North Korea, but most importantly now, the Workers' Party of Korea of North Korea state trading companies operations inside of the Chinese marketplace, this is very normal. The shocking factor is the normalcy with which these entities are operating in the Chinese marketplace. The Chinese view of this is that it's economic development activities. And one of the arrows that I think is important to highlight is that in October of 2009, then Premier Wen Jiabao led a very high-level Chinese delegation to Pyongyang. He signed 3 agreements with the then slightly recuperated Kim Jong-il, but soon to be dead Kim Jong-il. The first was economic development, the second was tourism, and third was education. Under Chinese law, that was a signal to the Chinese marketplace that it was okay to do business with North Korean state trading companies. That was economic development. If you look at the language of the UNSCRs, and particularly the 5 UN Security Council resolutions that North Korea wants lifted, it says that member states are not prohibited from engaging in economic development and humanitarian activities with North Korea. So there's your legal loophole. The other piece of this type of interaction is that China's relationship with North Korea, it's a very comprehensive one. It's not just the positive security assurance. And so this is the part that, from a North Korean perspective, whatever the US is about to offer, if these talks go forward, as many anticipate, how that particular security assurance from the United States is embedded in a larger package. So I wanted to conclude with, again, this message, not the mere function of offering a positive security assurance, but most importantly, again, what is that package agreement? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Park. That's a very interesting presentation on how do we provide the security assurance to the DPRK, especially from the China's package, having concentration on Chinese package. Secondly, we will have Dr. Vipin Narang from MIT, who's well known to us by his study of nuclear strategy of small and medium-sized nuclear powers. Previously, most of our study was focused on the nuclear strategy of big nuclear powers, mostly based on MAD, mutual assured destruction. But there is a small nuclear powers with only tens or hundreds of nuclear weapons, but who are using them effectively for their own security. And I believe that he is going to probably mention some of these DPRK nuclear strategy. I hope that here's Dr. Vipin Narang, please.
Thank you, Bong-Geun. It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you to Professor Yim for having me. It's a real privilege also to be here with my former advisors, Professor Sagan, Professor Miller. And it's always a pleasure to be here in Seoul. So it's good to see everyone again. I took the prompt of the panel pretty literally, restarting the denuclearization process with North Korea. And as somebody who's been following the North Korean nuclear crisis now for several years and a student of nuclear strategy of regional powers, I thought I'd just give a brief overview, I think, of where we are in the North Korean nuclear crisis, how we got here, and where we might go forward. So I'm going to start with basically my bottom line up front with three sort of facts. I'm an academic, so all these facts are contestable, but three observations that I think help frame and guide where we are with the North Korean nuclear crisis and problem right now. The first observation, it is almost certainly the case that Kim Jong-un is not going to unilaterally and voluntarily disarm and give up, relinquish his nuclear weapons program. Fact or observation number two, taking them away by force or by military power is certainly too costly and will expose not only South Koreans and Japanese, but American personnel and American citizens in the region, potentially American citizens on the US mainland, to conventional and possibly nuclear retaliation. So that leaves you to basically a third observation, which is kind of the conclusion of these first two. If Kim Jong-un is not going to voluntarily disarm and give up his nuclear weapons, and you can't take them away by force, then you don't have to necessarily, quote unquote, accept nuclear North Korea. You don't even have to like nuclear North Korea. But you have to coexist with nuclear North Korea. And you have to manage the fact that North Korea, at least in the short to medium term, is going to possess a nuclear weapons capability that can be deliverable by short-range ballistic missiles, medium-range ballistic missiles, and at least to me, plausibly by ICBMs already. So where are we with the denuclearization process? It started off well with Singapore, right? So the historic Singapore summit, after Kim Jong-un had tested 3 ICBMs in 2017, the Hwasong-14 twice, and then the Hwasong-15 in November, thermonuclear test in September 2017, announces on January 1st, 2018 in his New Year's Day speech that North Korea has achieved its objective of that year, which he announced New Year's Day speech 2017, of completing North Korea's nuclear deterrent, by which he means a thermonuclear weapons capability on an ICBM, which is a final piece in North Korean nuclear strategy, holding at risk regional assets, particularly American bases, probably in Guam, Japan, with short and medium-range ballistic missiles that can be tipped with nuclear weapons, and then being able to deter American nuclear retaliation by being able to plausibly hold at risk the American mainland with ICBMs. So on January 1st, 2018, Kim Jong-un announces after Fire and Fury year, we've achieved and completed our nuclear deterrent. We can now shift our strategic line to economic development, but we will, and this is important, mass produce nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles for the aim of deployment. And that order has not been countermanded since 2018. So that order still stands. With confidence, Kim Jong-un begins the charm offensive. The Pyeongchang Olympics, Panmunjom Declaration, South Korea, with President Moon Jae-in. That leads to Singapore. The Singapore Agreement gets a bad rap for a lot of good reasons. It wasn't specific, but it was a roadmap. It had a very specific sequence. As vague as it was, the ambiguity was a feature and not a bug at Singapore. It was designed to provide both sides with flexibility to be able to implement the pathway laid out in the 4 points: building trust, peace regime, Denuclearization was the third point. Complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula was the third point. And then prisoners of war was the fourth point. Things started going south pretty quickly after Singapore, though, because it seemed after Singapore that Kim Jong-un had shown up pretending to disarm, and President Trump showed up pretending to believe him. And President Trump seemed okay with the idea of accepting or living with a nuclear North Korea. But there was a conflict within the US administration. You had hawks who could not accept nuclear North Korea and wanted to interpret denuclearization as complete disarmament. But for Kim Jong-un, that seemed to be a violation of what he believed was the tacit agreement at Singapore. And this came to a head, and the bill came due at Hanoi, where President Trump showed up after having stated repeatedly to the public that the North Korean nuclear crisis was over and that diplomacy was going well. He had a newfound lover in Kim Jong-un. They show up in Hanoi, where Kim Jong-un reasonably anticipated that President Trump would essentially ratify what had been agreed to at Singapore, which was a freeze of exercises in exchange for a missile testing freeze, nuclear testing freeze, potentially a peace declaration. But what Kim Jong-un was really hoping for was starting to get some sanctions relief. At the very least, waivers for inter-Korean trade, and starting to peel off the UN Security Council resolutions on sanctions. But both sides stuck to their maximalist positions. Kim Jong-un wanted full sanctions relief in exchange for what ended up being, it sounds like, most of Yongbyon. But President Trump, backed by John Bolton, demanded North Korea's complete subjugation of its nuclear weapons program, not just Yongbyon plus Alpha as it's known, but Yongbyon plus Alpha, Delta, Charlie, Bravo, Zulu, the biological, chemical weapons programs, the ballistic missile programs, the entire production programs for all the weapons of mass destruction and missile programs in North Korea. That was obviously going to be unacceptable to Kim Jong-un at that point. Since Singapore and then the Hanoi failure, North Korea has probably amassed enough fissile material at the higher end of DI estimates of for a dozen nuclear weapons, still producing at least highly enriched uranium, who knows how many ICBMs. And the last couple of months, North Korea has demonstrated very capable short-range ballistic missiles, and I think it's often overlooked in the media, but not amongst the analyst community, that the new KN-23 missile, which was first tested in May and then a couple weeks ago, is a very capable solid fuel missile with in-flight guidance system, so it can porpoise and dive and maneuver in flight, and can fly at a very low apogee, about 50 kilometers, 50, 60 kilometer apogee, which makes it very difficult for missile defenses to be able to intercept this missile. Coupled with the new multi-launch rocket system that North Korea has tested in the last week, which flies at an even lower and scarier 25 kilometer apogee, a speed of a reported Mach 6.9, 250 or so kilometer range missile, also solid fuel, which are very responsive and very capable. If I were South Korea or the US forces on the peninsula, these are nightmares for missile defenses. And North Korea is producing these weapons while the diplomatic process is going on. And as Scott said earlier, President Trump keeps saying, oh, these are short-range missiles. That's true. They're just short-range missiles. A lot of countries test short-range missiles. But these are very sophisticated. And North Korea is becoming more experienced and more comfortable with solid fuel missiles, more sophisticated in-flight guidance systems. And when these show up in the medium-range or the long-range missiles, it can pose a problem for missile defenses and for American defenses, not just in the region, but also in the homeland. So all of this, Kim Jong-un never said he was going to disarm, and in fact, through this entire process, he has been improving and expanding his missile and nuclear program. Kim Jong-un has also said that there is a very clear end-of-year deadline for the United States to so-called change its calculation, which it showed up to at Hanoi, basically demanding unilateral, complete North Korean disarmament before any sanctions relief can be offered. So the clock is ticking. All of this while North Korea is testing these short-range missiles. And the short-range missiles, are as President Trump denies the importance of the short-range missile tests, And in the short term, maybe that's not a bad thing, right? You want to keep the diplomatic option open. But if Kim Jong-un is trying to signal to President Trump his dissatisfaction with the upcoming tests and with the fact the United States is not willing to give sanctions relief in any form, and President Trump isn't hearing him, then Kim Jong-un may have to dial up the volume, right? And short-range tests may very quickly become medium-range tests, may become submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Oh, another footnote, we forgot that since Hanoi, Kim Jong-un has debuted at least 3 new sophisticated delivery systems, or wanted to show that he's developing these systems. The submarine prototype that was displayed a couple weeks ago, based on a Romeo-class submarine, Soviet Romeo-class submarine, can carry, I think according to South Korean estimates, 3 submarine-launched ballistic missiles with nuclear weapons. These are new and sophisticated capabilities. So we're approaching an end-of-year deadline, and all President Trump has shown so far, and the U.S. has shown to Kim Jong-un, is a handshake at Panmunjom, which is not nothing, but that was necessary to pick up what I call the 15 yards we lost at Hanoi. Right? The working-level talks had stalled after Hanoi, and President Trump had to go to Panmunjom to shake Kim Jong-un's hand in order to even try to jumpstart that process. So that was picking up lost ground. But that trip alone may not have had the desired effect, because it doesn't seem as if working-level talks have restarted yet. Now, Professor Moon is right. Then after the exercises, if Kim Jong-un is really only testing these missiles as a signal about his dissatisfaction with the exercises, then maybe we can pick up working-level talks after that. But what's been interesting, I think, from the North Korean propaganda and KCNA since the Panmunjom visit is that for the first time, North Korea is calling out President Trump on the exercises. Previously, there's been a lot of vituperation reserved for John Bolton and for Secretary Pompeo, but North Korea had spared President Trump. That changed a couple weeks ago when President Trump was called out personally by name for continuing with the exercises. It sounds like North Korea believes that that is a violation of the spirit of Singapore and a personal commitment that Kim Jong-un believes President Trump made to him about suspending the so-called war games, which it turns out President Trump actually did make at Singapore verbally to Kim Jong-un, but it's unclear whether both sides agree that what's being held between the U.S. and ROK are exercises or war games of the scale that President Trump agreed to suspend. So I'd say things are not going well. At the same time, the U.S. continues to sustain a maximum pressure campaign on North Korea, the problem being that a lot of the air of the maximum pressure campaign has been taken out by Russia and China, as John alluded to. So we're in a very precarious situation right now. The clock is ticking, and North Korea seems to be showing a lot of dissatisfaction and indicating that its patience is running out with the United States, which has so far showed no willingness to so-called change its calculation, unless the Beacon argument can win out in the administration. We got here because of 2 fundamental problems, though. There's been a lot of discussion about the discrepancy between the U.S. and North Korea's definition of denuclearization. I call this the scoping problem. They have a very different conception of what denuclearization means. For the United States, denuclearization means unilateral North Korean disarmament. At least that's what FFVD and CVID mean in the U.S. administration. CVID is complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of the North Korean nuclear program. North Korea rejected that formulation, and so I think Secretary Pompeo and the State Department went to thesaurus and came up with the final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea. North Korea views the term denuclearization much more expansively. Complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is, as I think was stated in the Panmunjom Declaration, the Pyongyang Declaration, basically a nuclear weapons-free zone. And that can be broadly defined as removing strategic assets such as U.S. As the F-35s, SSBNs, maybe even a reduction in U.S. strategic arms. It's unclear what the North Korean definition is exactly, except that it is much more expansive than the United States. So there's still no agreed-upon definition of denuclearization. But an equally big problem, which I don't think gets enough attention, is what I call the sequencing problem. Who goes first, right? The United States believes that denuclearization is required to happen first in order to build trust. North Korea believes exactly the reverse, that trust has to be built first before it can even talk about what it believes to be denuclearization, the expansive version of denuclearization. And then the problem has always been who goes first. In Hanoi, North Korea wanted sanctions relief up front before it dismantled Yongbyon. And the United States said, look, we've litigated Yongbyon at least twice before. We're not going to give you sanctions relief until it's verifiably dismantled. So this problem of who goes first is also equally, the sequencing problem is equally as big as the scoping problem. And going forward in any deal, who goes first, the chicken or egg problem, I think, is something that will also have to be worked out. So where do we go from here? Every day that passes without Trump's and Bolton's grand deal of complete disarmament is a day that North Korea gets stronger. So if unilateral disarmament isn't an option, at least try to slow the program down first, right? I think Professor Sagan mentioned this earlier. Arms control. Slow, cap, reverse, eliminate. Essentially, the blueprint that the United States had with India and Pakistan, it failed completely with both in 1998, but at least slowing the program first, getting on first base before trying to swing for the fences. So what does that look like? My personal view is that Yongbyon is worth a substantial amount to slow down fissile material production, even though everybody is fully aware that there are covert facilities outside of Yongbyon. It is not nothing to eliminate the only source of plutonium, only source of domestic production of tritium, although maybe North Korea has foreign sources of tritium, I don't know, and at least some portion of the uranium enrichment program. By starving the program of plutonium and potentially tritium, you are shaping and constraining the future force. It has a real impact, I think, on its ICBM thermonuclear weapons capabilities. And you're able to shut down a non-trivial proportion of its uranium enrichment capability. So at least you're slowing the growth of the fissile material program. And that can help build trust, where you can start talking about and litigating the production of ICBMs, other facilities down the road. I think Kim Jong-un wants sanctions relief. He's not willing to give up the farm to get it, but he might be willing to slow down the program to get it. So pushing on the door of unilateral disarmament, I think, is the wrong one. We've talked about this at length before. I think Steve Biegun has laid out a roadmap, something that is, as I think Professor Moon, the language that Professor Moon used was very similar to Steve Biegun's, right? Comprehensive in scope, step by step in implementation, and to get around the sequencing problem, implemented in tandem. So simultaneous implementation. And the United States can have snapback provisions for sanctions. You can have verification along the way as facilities are dismantled in North Korea. But this kind of formulation at least is a door that leads to a realistic outcome with North Korea, as opposed to what I think is somewhat delusional approach to complete disarmament up front before the U.S. can give any sanctions. So both sides have to walk off their maximalist positions. And I think at least for the United States, it could be that Kim Jong-un is bluffing about his end-of-the-year deadline. But I think if he's shown anything over the last couple of years is he doesn't bluff all that often. And I personally don't want to find out what's at the end of the road if he believes that the United States has not changed its calculation by the end of the year. We've seen short-range, very sophisticated short-range ballistic missile tests, and we know that there are other longer-range missiles and potentially SLBMs in the inventory that Kim Jong-un and his scientists and hardliners in North Korea, remember he has to answer to hardliners also, may want to test. So it may be that at the end of the year, if we don't make any progress, I shudder to think about what North Korea might test and how that might disrupt the process for President Trump of the United States. So I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Vipin was starting with a very pessimistic and realistic assessment of situations. And then he was coming up with a prescription that could be more of in his view, very realistic. But in some people could say that's somewhat from the liberal side, because you are pursuing more of starting from freeze, but which I agree with. Otherwise, we're going to come up with much worse situations. Next, we have Professor Benjamin Valentino, Associate Professor of Political Science from Dartmouth University. He was giving us a talk about the trend of U.S. public opinion on the DPRK. Please enlighten us.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. This is my first time in Seoul. You have a truly beautiful city. I wish it were a little bit cooler, but besides that, really lovely, and I hope I'll get many chances to come back and explore further. This morning, Professor Sagan, my colleague, covered a lot of the work that we've been doing on public opinion with respect to the use of force against Korea by the United States public. But we've done a lot more in our polling work than just that, than just looking at that one response to the North Korean threat, the use of force. And so what I'm going to talk with you about today is both a little bit deeper view of how the United States public conceptualizes the threat from North Korea, and then what are the range of responses that they might consider. And I think this is important to look at the public's attitudes on this, because one thing we have to remember is that any deal that's ultimately hashed out with the North Koreans is not just technical. It's not just whether we can verify it. It's not just whether it meets the security needs of both sides, but political. And that politics extends to all the major parties. It has to be acceptable to the public of the United States, of course, to the public of South Korea, our other allies, and North Korea. And if you doubt that, remember what happened to the last major nuclear deal that the United States negotiated, the Iran deal, the JCPOA. That deal was never especially popular in the United States, and not just among Republicans. Democrats were never enamored with that deal either. And so we want to make sure that any deal that might come out, fingers crossed that some deal ultimately does, of our negotiations with the North, don't suffer the same fate. And so one thing I'll try to talk about is what are the outlines of the kind of deal that the U.S. public might be willing to accept. I'll get us started. I don't need to go into this because many people have walked through the timeline. I just want to emphasize kind of how brief this period of crisis really was. You could start it in 2016 with the DPRK nuclear test then. I think maybe even push it back into 2017. And then, at least from the perspective of many Americans, the crisis eased in March of 2018 when Trump announced that there would be a meeting with Kim Jong-un. And you can see that if you look at this poll. This is the closest one I could find that really goes back very far in time. It just asks Americans to say who they think is the United States' greatest enemy. And what you see here is just the number of people who said they think that it's North Korea. And you could see, despite a lot of time passing and even the production of testing of nuclear weapons in North Korea in 2005, quite a lot of stability, with North Korea seldom being seen by Americans as the number one threat. Usually that place has been reserved for Russia or Iran, sometimes China. But then for a brief moment during the crisis, a huge spike, where more than half of the American public sees North Korea as the greatest threat to American security. That's not just happening in the United States. So here's a poll that took place in the spring of 2018. So unfortunately, some of these countries, it's before the announcement of the summit, and some of them it's after. But you can see broadly, and even in countries that seem to have relatively little connection to the peninsula, usually a majority of the population seeing the North Korean nuclear program as a major threat. 60% of people in Brazil see the North Korean nuclear program as a major threat to their security. Just one other way to look at this, and I think this is important because we have a partisan breakdown in the United States here on this poll question, is another one of these long-asked questions: do we think of the DPRK as mainly a friend and an ally, or mainly an enemy or unfriendly to the United States? And what you can see here maybe follow the dashed lines, which are the number of people who say they think it's an enemy, with the red traditionally the Republican color and the blue the Democratic color, is that forever Republicans have been more likely to say they saw North Korea as an enemy than Democrats. And if anything, that spiked up a little bit right during the crisis. And then you notice by August of 2018, it flips with a really amazing decline among Republicans in perception of enemy status. Fully 20% of Republicans in August of 2018 saying they think that the North is a friendly or an ally to the United States, whereas Democrats, interestingly, pretty stable, if anything, a little bump up during this period, which undoubtedly is just a reaction against Trump during this time. And again, just to get a sense of how partisan reactions are in the perception of the North Korean threat, we can look at this simple question that came out soon after the Singapore summit in 2018, when President Trump claimed that the North Korean threat was over. And you could see 41% of Republicans agreed with that statement at that time, but only 6% of Democrats did. So a very polarized response, and not necessarily what you would have expected had that question been asked under a Democratic administration. So quite significant partisanship. Okay, moving on, we might want to ask just empirically, what does the public think that North Korea can do? How do they perceive their military capabilities against the United States? And here's a question that I found that was asked all the way back in 2013, and then again in 2017. And not surprisingly, you see quite a significant increase in the number of people who think that North Korea is capable of launching a nuclear missile that could strike the United States. Scott and I asked a similar question with maybe a little bit more detail, again in February 2019, when the poll that Scott discussed this morning was conducted. And here you can see it's actually, our results seem to suggest lower numbers of people who really believe this. So instead of just asking, can they hit the United States, we asked, when do you think they will be able to? Maybe that led some people to believe that they had an option of saying not yet. And so we asked, they can strike us now, they can strike us in a year, or 5 years, or more than 5 years. And you can see by that measure, and again here, interestingly, the results are not especially partisan. They don't break down. A lot of Americans tend to see this in the same way. The single largest category is that it won't be for 5 years, although if you add category 1 and 2, those are people who in February 2019 said within a year. That's where the bulk of the respondents lie. So again, certainly movement towards a sense that they can strike us, but a significant percentage of Americans who don't believe that North Korea currently has the capability to strike the United States. That surprised me when I saw those results. Now, I thought this was one of the most important questions that we asked in the poll, and we didn't have a way to really get it into the article that Scott talked about this morning. But one thing I think it's important to know if we want to understand how Americans think about North Korea is why we think that Kim Jong-un might want nuclear weapons. What is it that North Korea seeks to achieve with its nuclear weapons? And so we asked Americans to choose between one of these 4 categories. Did they want to have nuclear weapons so that they could conquer South Korea? Did they want to have nuclear weapons to deter the United States from attacking them? Did they want to use those nuclear weapons as soon as possible against the United States? Are they just inherently hostile to us and hoping to strike us and inflict pain as soon as they can? Or did Kim Jong-un intend them to increase his prestige at home and abroad? And you can see that's where the vast majority of the public lies. Which I thought was somewhat reassuring. I feared that there might be more people in the use against the United States as soon as possible category. And again, not huge partisan differences here. A little bit more of the Republicans in the increase his prestige, and a little bit more of the Democrats in the deter the U.S. from attacking him category. But more agreement between the parties than we've seen in some other slides. Okay, so now let's try to turn to the question of what is the United States public willing to do about this threat that we've just kind of walked through how they see. And I'll start with a very general look at this. Again, one of the longest poll series we have is on this classic question that essentially measures isolationism versus interventionism in the American public, with the blue line, again, being Democrats, the red line, Republicans. And one thing that you can see, which I think is contrary to what a lot of people expected, is that the decrease in the Republican internationalist sentiment happens before Trump comes to office, before he even begins his campaign. It looks, if anything, like it might have been a reaction to the Obama presidency, and it just stays low after that. And on the contrary, you see a major spike in the willingness of Democrats to support interventionism, and that certainly is a response to Donald Trump, who made it a point to say the U.S. would pull back, and I think Democrats reflexively wanted to push back against that. So on the one hand, it's clear that we're in Democrats are in an internationalist mood, more willing perhaps to be interventionist in a place like Korea than you might have expected. But let's ask the question a little bit more specifically. So again, this is a question that's been asked all the way since 1990, where the public is asked to say, would they support the use of troops? So this sounds like a ground war against North Korea if North Korea invaded South Korea. And interestingly, when that question was asked in 2017 and 2018, we got the highest willingness to use troops that's ever been recorded since we started answering the question, with clear majorities supporting that. And then I didn't have the partisan breakdown for that whole series, but Scott and I asked, the Chicago Council asked that question in July 2018, and you could see, again, not particularly partisan here. The American public broadly willing to support South Korea if it's invaded, also broadly willing if Japan is attacked by North Korea. The next slide looks again at this question of what about the use of force? And this one was taken at the height of the crisis in August 2017. And you can see, again, a huge partisan split here, with 71% of Republicans in August 2017 saying they would support using conventional weapons to attack North Korea's nuclear facilities, with just 27% of Democrats doing so. So again, you're going to see the tremendous shift in Republican views here, and to the extent there's been a trend recently, it's really been among the Republicans becoming much more dovish than they are on almost any other national security issue, except maybe Russia lately. Then we asked this question about whether Kim Jong-un can be deterred. Again, that's obviously critical. If Americans think that Kim Jong-un can't be deterred, that's going to make the use of force much more attractive. And the good news is majorities among both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party actually say they do think that he can be deterred, at least against using nuclear weapons against South Korea or the United States. So that's a positive thing. But then a little bit surprisingly, when we asked the question this way, and it gets to what Vipin just said, can the U.S. learn to live with nuclear North Korea? Most Republicans do not agree with that, despite the fact that they just said in the previous slide that they think he could be deterred. They still don't want to live with a nuclear-armed North Korea, whereas, again, a small majority of Democrats, 57%, are willing to do so. Now we can get into some specific deals and how the public would react. So the first one is, one of the deals that was discussed as a, possible outcome of the Singapore summit, which is what if the North Koreans offered to permanently freeze production and testing of nuclear weapons and missiles, and in return, the United States said that it would not conduct these military exercises. And the vast majority of the American public seems to support that, both Democrats and Republicans. And you'll see in a moment, it's quite likely that they see that as a first step and not as the ultimate end of the deal, but again, suggests that there is some bargaining space here for initial steps. Here's another specific outcome that we can look at. Again, this poll from 2018. If North Korea gave up all of its nuclear weapons, would the public support a complete or partial withdrawal of US forces from the peninsula? And you could see a majority of all the parties supports a partial withdrawal, but less than 20% support a complete withdrawal, even if North Korea gives up all of its nuclear weapons. So again, the American commitment to South Korea seems to be quite strong. This is the poll question that I think is maybe the most, should give us the most pause. And so the question is, can the United States accept any deal with the North that allows North Korea to keep its nuclear weapons? And the majority of both Democrats and Republicans say, no, we can't, or they agree that we cannot accept such a deal. And so that, I think, really suggests that in the long run, although we might accept some short-term deals on the way to complete disarmament, the public is not prepared to accept a deal that ends with something partial. Wrapping up here, a couple other possible solutions. One that was mentioned already, what if, as part of this process, South Korea got its own nuclear weapons? You could see virtually no support for that among the American public, politics of any stripe. Then a question that's, I think, also quite important. What does the public think about how likely it is that North Korea will actually give up all of its weapons? And here you can see, again, among none of the different political parties, do a majority think that it's likely that we will get the solution that I just told you. The public says, ultimately, we can only accept a solution that does result in this. So that, to me, sounds like a recipe for disaster. And again, let's return to this slide. This is the same poll question that Scott talked about this morning and said is quite terrible, and I agree. But Scott talked about the September 2017 poll, where we see that 58% of the public said at that point they would favor using, taking military action against North Korea if diplomacy and economic sanctions failed. You could see that's gone down in 2018. Our poll was conducted in 2019 and found results not too far off from the 2018 numbers there. So this suggests that, in fact, that's likely where the public is. But I find that disconcerting, as I said, because I think what it means is that President Trump has set up the public to believe he can secure a deal that will get rid of the North's nuclear weapons, that will not merely be a step along the way, and that both Democrats and Republicans think that's unlikely to happen. And they also think that if it doesn't happen, if that doesn't result, then a fairly substantial number of Americans, maybe a bare minority, would support the use of military force, and that's obviously a situation that we hope we don't find ourselves in. Thanks.
So now we see what is the political landscape of public opinion in the U.S. I think that could be a great reference that we can use when we have our public diplomacy in the U.S. And next, we have Dr. Dong Zhao. He's a fellow at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy based in China. So please.
Thank you so much. There is a recent change in the North Korean policy. North Korea used to demand economic sanction relief in its negotiation with the United States, but recently it has been shifting towards asking for security assurance. So it's important to discuss security assurance, and John made a great presentation calling the Chinese efforts as China's sunshine policy toward North Korea. I think it's important to look at China, which is an important player in this region and over this issue. So I will try to also offer a few additional points about why China might have changed its approach toward North Korea in 15 months or a little more than that. The first reason I think is the opposite approach simply wouldn't work for China. In 2017, China tried the pressure approach, worked with the United States imposing tough sanctions against North Korea. And the result for China was North Korea became really angry against China. North Korea's official media outlets openly and harshly criticized China. And there were even reported internal North Korean statements pointing to their Hwasong 12 medium-range ballistic missiles and saying that they can reach the entirety of Chinese territory. So China was basically under threat from DPRK. I think that made many Chinese experts realize that for China to push North Korea really hard on the issue of denuclearization means that there is a real risk that China can turn itself into an enemy of a nuclear-armed North Korea. So in order to avoid that worst-case outcome, I think there is basically no chance that China would ever go all the way to cut off North Korea's economic lifeline or to implement a comprehensive embargo against North Korea. So the opposite approach of sanctioning, pressuring, strangling North Korea wouldn't work. A second reason, I think, is related to the emergence of big power competition between the United States and China. As Professor Shen this morning mentioned, when DPRK and the United States started to talk in 2018, China suddenly started to worry about losing DPRK to the United States. I think for many Chinese experts, DPRK is like a chess piece that both of the big powers, United States and China, can use against the other big power. So if North Korea might be used by the United States to cause trouble for China, why shouldn't China take a step quicker and try to develop a closer relationship with DPRK? In other words, to keep DPRK closer to Beijing than to Washington. And for China, DPRK still plays a very important role in deciding the future security structure over the Korean Peninsula in case North Korea is willing to denuclearize. So in order for Chinese voice to be heard, I think China also feels it needs to keep North Korea close in order to have its own interests respected and implemented in terms of the future regional landscape. Third reason, I think, for China to sympathize with DPRK is also very useful for Beijing to achieve its own security interests. Right, so China has been saying that DPRK has a point. It needs security guarantee from the United States and South Korea in order to feel safe enough to disarm. So basically, Beijing tries to turn the security assurance on the United States. Right, you should really provide a substantive security guarantee, meaning that you should seriously consider withdrawing troops reduce your military footprint, or even downgrade the security alliance relationship with South Korea. So there is something that Beijing can achieve that is really important for China, which is to undermine the alliance relationship and to reduce American military presence in this region. So it also aligns with Chinese own security interests. And the fourth reason is, despite the recent dialogue in the negotiations, many Chinese experts, including officials, I think, do believe that DPRK is willing to disarm. Some senior scholars who advised the government made this point very frequently. And I think they really believe in it. And many former senior officials who recently retired also believe that Kim Jong-un has made that big decision to trade his nuclear weapons for substantive security and economic benefits. And we already have 5 summit meetings between the two heads of state of China and DPRK. So there are also many opportunities for Kim Jong-un to personally talk to President Xi that I'm really aiming at disarming, denuclearization. So I think there is a fair chance that Chinese top leader has been persuaded that Kim Jong-un is ready to denuclearize. And at the same time, many Chinese experts attribute the recent lack of diplomatic progress not to DPRK unwillingness to compromise, but to the American insistence on complete denuclearization in once and for all approach. So they attribute the problem to lack of flexibility in the American position. And as a result, because there's a real belief, at least in important quarters within the Chinese expert community, they believe there is a big chance we can achieve denuclearization, but the problem is how to figure out the right sequencing and scoping problem. And therefore, I think that's why China has made efforts working on a roadmap. Right? So China has been working with Russia to design a denuclearization roadmap, but that effort has yielded very little progress, I think, so far. The second question is, even if China is fully willing to provide security assurance to North Korea, will that security assurance work to North Korea? I do hope it would work. But I think there are also reasons that we should not be too optimistic. The first reason is China's security assurance to North Korea will always be easily reversible. This applies to any security assurance measures, including those that can be provided by the United States. The biggest reason I believe that North Korea so far has rejected American security assurance is because any measures the United States might take in terms of reducing troops, providing declaratory guarantee, those measures cannot be made irreversible. So the irreversibility of security assurance is a fundamental challenge. And for China to provide positive security assurance to DPRK, then the negative security assurance that might be provided by the United States, I think making that assurance irreversible and credible would be even more important for DPRK. And even though, as John mentioned, in China, the leadership, of the Communist Party never changes, and President Xi might stay on forever. But I think there are a lot of examples of how Chinese policies can change dramatically overnight. Right? Just during the trade war between US and China, when the negotiations were deadlocked, for a few days, the Chinese central TV television would show anti-American movies to the public. And then when the negotiations suddenly showed some promise for result, suddenly they changed the movie to a pro-American movie, telling a story of how American soldier and a young Chinese lady can fall in love. Right? It changed overnight. So I wouldn't count that much on China's security guarantee would appear very credible or sustainable or irreversible to DPRK. A second reason I think is both DPRK and China I think are taking a transactional approach in dealing with each other. Right? The two leaders in both countries have been in power for years. They didn't meet once. But once after North Korea achieved the basic deterrent, started the charm offensive, tried to reach out to international community and try to talk to the United States, suddenly they started to meet 5 times in 15 months. I don't think there's any trust involved in that. I don't think there's any personal chemistry involved. It's all based on cold-headed calculation of national interests. And I don't think that's a good foundation for China to provide irreversible security assurance to DPRK. The third reason, we only also need to look at the US-China relationship. The US-China relationship is a comprehensive relationship. They have very deep economic, social, cultural, scientific connections for decades. But still, that doesn't change the Chinese perception today that the United States really intends to undermine China, really intends to contain China. United States doesn't want China to succeed, right? That's the popular perception in China and has nothing to do with the decades-long comprehensive and deep relationship. So I'm not sure if China is willing to develop a comprehensive relationship with DPRK, that would mean much to North Korea. But I think a deeper question is why did North Korea shift its demand from economic sanction relief to security assurance? Of course, one possible theory is DPRK really wants security assurance. And that is really good news if it is true, because that means North Korea still wants to be reassured. Right? That offers hope for denuclearization. However, there's also the possibility that this is a negotiation tactic by DPRK. Because North Korea knows very well that for a substantive security guarantee, North Korea would ask the United States to withdraw troops, to cut off its alliance relationship with South Korea, and those measures would never be accepted by either US nor South Korea. And therefore, by asking the United States for the impossible, it creates the opportunity that when the United States rejects, North Korea can say, okay, let's all move to the second best outcome. I wouldn't fully denuclearize, but I will put some limit. And I do not ask you to do troop reduction or troop removal, but how about you provide economic sanction relief? Right? I think that could be a negotiating tactic. In that way, North Korea can end up returning nuclear weapons as well as having economic sanction relief. I'm not saying this is the North Korean intent. I'm simply pointing out this possibility, especially if we are thinking about decision-making regarding DPRK in the next step. Lastly, regardless of North Korea's intent, I think one Chinese thinking about North Korea deserves a serious consideration by the broader international community. because China, there is a Chinese conviction that the reason why North Korea developed nuclear weapons is because North Korea is a deeply paranoid nation. And that paranoia is because a lack of good, deep, accurate, and balanced understanding about the outside world. Right? And that lack of good understanding and deep bias toward the outside world is because decades-long isolation of DPRK from the international system. Right? I say this because if you look at China, China is somewhere between United States and DPRK in the sense that China is a semi-open society. Right? It has been partially open to the outside world for decades. And still in China, you can see there is deep distrust towards the United States. Many people, including senior experts and senior officials, sincerely believe the United States intend to harm China. Right? In the recent demonstration in Hong Kong, there is a wide belief in China that the American CIA is behind the protests in Hong Kong, right? Which is a joke in the outside world. But that shows the wide perception gap caused by lack of information access. So if we are facing this situation of a big perception gap on basic issues, there is no way that we can resolve the problems. So I think it's important that we focus on changing the mindset of North Korea as a nation, not just building a new security structure or new security institution in this region. I mean, that's important. But even after you put a new security structure in the region, that wouldn't change the existing mindset of the North Korean people. So that wouldn't resolve the fundamental problems. They will still see things in an old perspective. So if we agree this is important, I think in the future we need to rethink how we deal with DPRK, because the current American maximum pressure strategy really works contrary to the long-term goal of opening up DPRK, reforming DPRK, and transforming DPRK. So we need better coordination between short-term goal of putting pressure on DPRK and the long-term goal of seeking, transforming, opening, changing the mindset of DPRK. With that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Another complicating factor is Chinese role in this situation. I think he portrayed how China is seeing the situation and come up with a couple of suggestions for that. And lastly, but more importantly, the Professor Nobumasa Akiyama is waiting. And he's a professor of international relations and the public policy at the Hitotsubashi University. He's been very active in this, not only policy research, but himself participated in the government during the last few years. And we'd like to hear his own view and also the position of how this Japan is seeing the current situation of this North Korean nuclear problem. Please.
Thank you very much. I normally very much look forward to coming to Seoul for nice food and friendship. But this time, I feel I have a little bit of hesitance due to the difficult bilateral relationship. And in fact, this is one of the issues which I may have to touch upon at the end of my presentation. But before that, I would like to address a couple of issues related to the sustainability of the denuclearization process. And also, I would like to mention in this presentation how Japan would think the sustainability of denuclearization. Normally, when we talk about the denuclearization, the main actors are obviously United States and the North Korea, and of course South Korea is part of it. But in many cases, particularly outside of Japan, the Japan's interests and the roles could be maybe even ignored, or maybe even if it's touched upon, but it's kind of minor. But my presentation rather emphasize the importance of engaging all stakeholders rather than the limited numbers, including China and partially Russia. With this, I would like to say a couple of things, but I think some of the issues have already been covered by other excellent speakers, so I try to kind of cut short my presentation so that we have more time for discussion. In talking about the sustainability of denuclearization, maybe we should think about three things. One is, how are we going to meet different expectations among the major stakeholders? The two, how are we going to address the question of definition of denuclearization? And obviously, technologically speaking, it is a very clear-cut sort of standard of to what extent we are going to address in entire nuclear program of North Korea, but it's also very much subject to the politics of the game of how to define the denuclearization. And third, we also need to talk about when and how the North Korea should declare their nuclear materials and programs, activities, and how to verify. These are also technical questions, but at the same time, the politics is heavily involved. So what are the expectations that the major stakeholder holds from the denuclearization process? Obviously, North Korea is seeking the regime survival and security assurances, and possibly and secondarily the economic assistance. But the United States, I'm not so sure about it, in fact, because of the so many different actors entangled in the domestic politics. But if we think that the president has a very strong power, then possibly the first priority is making a deal itself, whatever the contents would be. And but for the decent policy advocates in the area of non-proliferation, I think the question is when and how to achieve the complete denuclearization, and maybe possibly address the security concerns of US allies and itself. And South Korea obviously prioritized the establishment of peace regime, and then this is the security on the Korean Peninsula. But what about Japan? Japan may be still seeking the complete denuclearization or nuclear threat reduction as a priority number one. And then in my observation, it seems to me that that Japan is gradually accepting the concept of a phased approach or a step-by-step approach. But still, I think Japan really strongly hopes to retain the goal of complete denuclearization. But at the same time, Japan has its own unique issue with North Korea, that is the solution of the abduction issue. And that very much affects our government's policy making, particularly in the context of domestic political narratives. And China, I think Tong Zhao elaborated in a very eloquent fashion, so I don't think I need to explain further on that. And let me talk a little bit about denuclearization, how to define, or when to define. Right? So defining denuclearization is a the process itself has a meaning. So they have meaning of, first, setting the scope of work of this entire process, and second, converging different expectations and incorporating these expectations, which makes the deal more sustainable and maybe reach to the sort of a complete solution of so-called North Korea problem rather than the denuclearization itself. And finally, that would probably to provide the basis for the threat reduction and hedging strategy for the allies of the United States. So that these three functions are in the process of defining the denuclearization. So the question is, when should we make a work, when should we define the denuclearization? And it's obvious from the past experience that, that addressing this question at the beginning of the negotiation is not a good strategy for the negotiation. But at a certain point, we have to do this. So the question is when. So now we are at the stage of the freeze to freeze, and then the next step possibly would be dismantlement of Yongbyon facilities. Then next one should be defining the denuclearization, and then thinking about modality of verification and declaration verification. But declaration verification are closely associated with the how to fulfill the North Korean concerns of their threats against posed by the denuclearization process itself. So then Professor Moon actually touched upon the reference to the 1992 joint declaration of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula as a reference for the concept of denuclearization. And on that, that gives us a very interesting question. One, are we going to accept North Korea to retain its own fuel cycle, including enrichment and reprocessing? And with regard to the enrichment, because North Korea has a uranium mine, and when they claim that the uranium mine should be utilized for the economic growth, then how can we deny that kind of request? But if we are going to be strict about the language of the joint declaration, actually it prohibits the possession of a nuclear fuel cycle in both North and South Koreas. So how can we reconcile these kind of problems? So what about declaration verification? So I don't think it's possible to have a complete and full declaration of the materials and activities without the confidence between North Korea and the rest of the world. So the major question is, how are we going to build the confidence? So when the confidence should come first, then as Professor Moon mentioned, maybe we could think about, we have a couple of steps ahead of the declaration. But, the complete if we are going to follow the principles of the verification, declaration verification of the IAEA safeguards system, then we have to verify the completeness and correctness of the declaration by the North Korea, and that requires very much intrusive inspections. And I'm skeptical whether North Korea would accept such an intrusive inspection at the early stage of the denuclearization process. So, but then if also North Korea is determined to retain its nuclear weapons for the time being, not for forever, it would prefer the verification in a kind of arms control mode. And if you have a verification in arms control mode, then you have a sort of larger latitude of the maneuverabilities. And so, because as long as this uncertainty would not undermine the strategic and affect the strategy in a strategically significant way, then the completeness and correctness may not be so strictly pursued. In the meantime, if the verification and the declaration verification should follow the standard of the IAEA, then significant quantity which is not tolerated in the other safeguards will be very narrow. So 8 kilograms of plutonium, 25 kilograms highly enriched uranium. So in order to fulfill such a kind of a requirement in the safeguards, I don't think I think North Korea has to open up all relevant facilities to the inspectors. So I don't think that is going to happen in the near-time future. So that's very much to do with security of North Korea. So question once again, when and how are we going to address this? And who is going to inspect? Who is going to be the inspectors for the such verification activities? Is it the United States or ROK or something? I saw a very interesting panel of the fellows that it says, they should establish kind of ABAC model between North and South Koreas. And of course, I got a couple of questions, but there may be interesting idea to pursue. So in overall, if we are going to have the sustainable denuclearization, apart from these technical issues, I'm thinking about like 3 conditions in the political side. One, that we have to design the phased approach in a very flexible fashion, but with clearly shared end game of the complete denuclearization. Without it, I don't think it's possible for us to make the process sustainable. And the second, we have to design the scheme or the kind of appropriate and fair balance between incentives and actions or measures of denuclearization with benchmarks. And third, we have to think about political sustainability in every stakeholder's domestic politics, as well as in alliance politics. So I think I'm running out of time, so I would like to talk finally on the political sustainability. In the past, many agreements between the United States and North Korea on the denuclearization has been reversed when the US changed the government. And I'm sure that North Korea is closely watching the next election. So so it really depends on how the U.S. election evolves. But at the same time, what are the sustainable arrangement and modality of the agreement? If the current government is going to make an agreement with North Korea, we have to think about elements which made the sort of a denuclearization process continued even after the change of the government or after the election. And secondly, I think we have to we need to think about the credibility of the leaders' capacity of negotiating with the United States on an equal footing on the side of North Korea. And I think this is very important. And thirdly, in Japan, in fact, the current administration insisted on a kind of very, in a sense, in unrealistic, I would say, the narrative, that is that Japan would not make a rapprochement with North Korea without a solution of the abduction issue by returning all abductees from North Korea. And I don't think that is a realistic narrative. So I think Japanese government needs some time to change the narrative, and of course, probably by communicating with North Korea and communicating with the United States and other allies. And finally, on the alliance politics, so now South Korea and Japan have difficulty in the various issues, but I don't think we have a luxury to sort of fight over a couple of issues. So I would suggest first decouple some outstanding issues or problems between two countries and have a better coordination mechanism for among 3, Japan, United States, and the South Korea on the shared goal of denuclearization. Thank you very much.
I somehow failed to manage our time schedule. Now we will take a 10 minutes break and we'll continue our session at 5:10.